Jamal Hayes had experienced many tense moments in the courtroom, but what transpired that evening on his own neighborhood streets was something he never anticipated. So if it was a place he associated with peace where he could escape the trials and tribulations of his professional life, yet as he stood with his hands on the hood of his own car, he felt none of the tranquility his neighborhood usually offered. As he complied with Officer Karen Michaels' demand, Jamal's thoughts raced back to earlier that day in court. He had presided over a contentious case, one that had attracted widespread media attention. It involved a complex dispute between a multinational corporation and a group of low-income homeowners fighting against a hazardous waste facility being constructed near their community. Jamal's ruling, which halted the construction and demanded further environmental evaluations, was hailed as a victory for justice and the rights of marginalized communities. His decision had been meticulously crafted, ensuring that both the letter and spirit of the law were upheld. But now the same legal acumen and steadfastness he wielded in the courtroom were meaningless. Standing in his tailored gray suit, Jamal was no longer Judge Hayes, the respected jurist who commanded attention, intention, and deference. He was just another suspect, another black man subjected to the prejudices, assumptions of a system he had dedicated his life to improving. Stay still, Officer Michaels barked, as if addressing a dangerous felon instead of a law-abiding citizen. Her hand never left the holstered weapon at her hip, an unspoken reminder of the power imbalance between them. Jamal clenched his fists, willing himself to stay composed. One wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, and the situation could spiral out of control. So mind if I ask what you were doing out here? She sneered, feigning politeness. We don't usually see cars like this around these parts at night. Jamal took a deep breath before responding. I was heading home after a long day of work. Officer, so I lived just a few blocks down. He nodded toward the corner where the street lights cast a soft glow over the grand houses. Their careful quality tints are housing the quiet cul-de-sacs that branch off into a network of seemingly safe spaces. The irony was not lost on him. He had chosen this neighborhood precisely because it was supposed to be a refuge. So he had worked tirelessly to afford a life here, believing that success would shield him from the biases and assumptions that plague other parts of society. Yet here he was being treated like an intruder in his own domain. Officer Michaels eyed him skeptically. And what kind of work do you do? She asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge. I'm a judge, Jamal replied evenly, refusing to let his voice betray the simmering anger beneath his calm facade. For a split second, the surprise flickered across Michael's face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. A judge, in a suit like that, driving a car like this, I suppose you just came from ruling on some important case. She laughed, the sound sharp and derisive. Yes, as a matter of fact, I did. Jamal said, his gaze steady. And if you like to confirm, I'd be more than willing to provide my ID and badge number. But Officer Michaels didn't seem interested in verification. She continued her search, tossing aside his belongings with an air of contempt. So don't move, she snapped before striding back to her patrol car to run his plates. Jamal stood beside his vehicle, his eyes fixed on a cluster of onlookers that had gathered at the end of the block. Among them, he recognized Mrs. Davenport, his elderly neighbor, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. She was watching with wide eyes, her mouth set in a disapproving frown. Next to her, Mr. Clark, Mr. retired school teacher, who always waved when Jamal drove by, looked on with a mix of shock and uncertainty. The humiliation of the moment gnawed at Jamal. These were people he exchanged pleasantries with every morning. To people who knew him as a neighbor, not a suspect. Yet now, they were witnessing him treated like a criminal, a dangerous element who didn't belong. Finally, Officer Michaels returned, her expression sour. Seems like everything checks out, she muttered, as if begrudgingly conceding his innocence. Is that all, officer? Jamal asked, striving to keep his tone measured. You're free to go, she said curtly. But as Jamal reached for his car door, she leaned in close, her eyes narrowed. But next time, be careful where you drive at night. Don't want any misunderstandings. Jamal met her gaze squarely. I'll keep that in mind, he said, his voice low but firm. So he got back into his car, the leather seat cool against his back. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. He sat there for a moment, willing the tension to drain from his body. Slowly, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The onlookers were beginning to disperse, but the image of their faces, curious, judgmental, and perhaps even a little afraid, was seared into his memory. Jamal knew he could file a complaint. He could leverage his position, make calls, demand accountability. But would it matter? Would it change anything? As a judge, he had the power to shape lives, to interpret the law in ways that could alter the course of history. But in that moment, sitting in the driver's seat of his own car, Jamal felt powerless because the law, the system he believed in, that he fought for, wasn't designed to protect people like him from situations like this. So with a sigh, he pulled the car in gear and drove off slowly, the taillights of his sedan casting long shadows on the empty street. Tomorrow, he would don his robe, take his place on the bench, and continue his work. But tonight, in the solitude of his car, the raw sting of injustice lingered, a harsh reminder that even those who upheld the law could be betrayed by it. As he turned onto his street and pulled into his driveway, the quiet of his home enveloped him. And he stepped out of the car, glanced around the familiar surroundings, and for the first time felt like a stranger in his own neighborhood. After what felt like an eternity, Officer Karen Michaels returned, her demeanor unchanged. "Everything seems clean," she muttered, though the sarcasm still dripped from her voice. "But I'm going to need to take you down to the station to clear this up." The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. Jamal felt a sharp jolt of disbelief course through him. "To the station? On what grounds?" he demanded, his voice low but firm. He had expected the situation to end with her realizing her error, not escalate to an unwarranted arrest. She crossed her arms defiantly, her eyes flashing with a defiance fueled by a mix of arrogance and insecurity. "And I don't like your attitude," she snapped, stepping closer, as if challenging him to resist. "And something about this just doesn't sit right with me. We'll figure it out down." Jamal clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. But there was a limit to his patience. "Officer, I've complied with everything you've asked. There's no reason for this to go any further. I advise you to think carefully before you make a serious mistake," he warned, his tone measured but edged with the authority of someone who knew the law inside and out. Michaels let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "A mistake? You think you can tell me what to do?" "Get in the car." Jamal exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the injustice bear down on him. He had worked his entire career defending the law, and now that same law was being twisted against him by someone who had sworn to you uphold it. Enough was enough, huh? Without another word, Jamal pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Officer Michaels watched, her expression shifting to one of disdainful amusement. "Charlie, someone to bail you out?" she sneered, her lips curling into a smirk. "Go ahead." Jamal didn't respond. He made the call, his voice calm, speaking in quiet, clipped tones that hinted at a restrained intensity. The conversation was brief, and when he ended the call, he turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "Phillips, I suggest you wait here for a few minutes," he said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. So Michael's eyebrows shot out. "Is that a threat?" she demanded, her hand inching closer to her holstered weapon. "No," Jamal replied, meeting her stare even. "It's a warning." Before Michaels could respond, the sound of another car pulling up broke the tense silence. So both turned to see a sleek, unmarked vehicle glide to a stop behind her patrol car. The vehicle bore the discreet emblem of the city's police department, and a dark suit stepped out, his movements brisk and purposeful. Even from a distance, the urgency in his stride was palpable. So the man approached, his face set in a stern frown. "Michaels, what exactly are you doing?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Michael's confidence wavered. "Just doing my job, sir," she replied, but her voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking from her to Jamal, then back to her. "Do you have any idea who this is?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. Michaels blinked, visibly taken aback. "He's the suspect in a possible stolen vehicle." "Kate," she stammered, glancing uncertainly at Jamal. The man shook his head, a look of incredulity crossing his features. "This is Jamal Hayes," he said slowly, enunciating each word as if speaking to a child. "One of the most respected judges in the state, and you just unlawfully detained him." Michael's face went white. The gravity of her mistake seemed to hit her like a physical blow. I didn't know, I thought." "You didn't think?" the man snapped, his voice hard as steel. "You saw a black man in a nice car and assumed the worst? This isn't just a misunderstanding, Officer Michaels. This is racial profiling." Jamal stood silently, watching the exchange. He had been wronged, humiliated even. For more than that, he had seen the ugly underlay of the system he was supposed to represent, the deeply entrenched biases that could turn an innocent evening drive into a nightmare. Michaels turned to Jamal, her expression a mix of fear and regret. I'm so sorry, sir. She stuttered, her voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't realize. She didn't realize who I was. Jamal finished quietly, his gaze flipped. That shouldn't matter. The way you treated me, the assumptions you made is unacceptable, no matter who I am. So the man in the suit nodded sharply. Judge Hayes, we're going to handle this immediately. So Officer Michaels will face disciplinary action for her conduct. You have my word. Jamal looked at Michaels, taking a panic in her eyes. You could see the realization dawning, the understanding that her life could be irreparably damaged by what she had done. But more than that, he saw something else, an opportunity. Disciplinary action, Jamal repeated slowly, considering. That's a start, but it's not enough. The man looked taken aback. Sir? Jamal's gaze never left Michaels. I'm not interested in ruining her life. What I want is for her and others like her to understand why this happened, to learn from it. I want training, community outreach, and concrete steps taken to ensure that this never happens again to me or anyone else. Michaels blinked, stunned. You're not going to press charges. Jamal sighed softly. What would that accomplish? You'd be replaced and the cycle will continue. I want real change, not just a scapegoat. The man in the suit nodded slowly, a look of respect crossing his face. Judge Hayes, I'll make sure your request is honored. We'll implement new training protocols for the entire department. Jamal inclined his head slightly. See that you do. With that, he turned and got back into his car, the leather seat creaking softly under him. He took a deep breath, letting the tension slowly drain from his shoulders. He glanced once more at Officer Michaels, whose shoulders had slumped in defeat, her eyes fixed on the ground. Now remember this moment, Officer Michaels, he said quietly, and use it to be better. Then he started the car, pulled away slowly, and left the scene behind him. As he drove through the quiet streets of his neighborhood, he couldn't help but think about the system he'd spent so long defending. The change, he realized, didn't always come from the bench. Sometimes it started right here on the streets in small, painful moments of reckoning. And as the evening deepened, the street outside Jamal's home grew quieter. The soft tune of crickets filled it ran. The rustling leaves created a gentle, lulling rhythm. He sat alone in his study, staring out the window. The world outside appeared so peaceful, but he knew the truth. The surface cone could be shattered in an instant by suspicion, fear, or hatred. So he leaned back in his leather chair, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Tonight, he wasn't just a judge. He was a man forced to confront the very prejudices he spent his life challenging. His life challenging. Jamal turned his gaze back to the draft of his proposal on the screen. It was a bold initiative, a community-led justice reform project that sought to reimagine how law enforcement and society interacted. The proposal wasn't about punishment, but prevention. He envisioned a comprehensive plan that was saying include not just anti-bias training, but also community, cultural education, and forums where officers and residents could share the stories face to face. He wanted to break down the walls of mistrust that had been built over generations, one conversation at a time. But Jamal knew that real change required more than words on paper. It demanded buy-in from every level of leadership, and most importantly, the willingness of people like Officer Michaels to see beyond the uniform, beyond the badge, and recognize the shared heritage in every person they encountered. He thought again about Michaels, the fear in her eyes as she realized her mistake, the defensive posture that had melted into confusion and finally a flicker of something else. So was it remorse, understanding, or simply fear for her own future? Jamal wasn't sure, but he wanted to believe that something had shifted in her. If there was even a chance to reach her and others like her, then he had to try. If you imagine a day when officers like Michaels would walk these same streets, not with suspicion, but with genuine familiarity and respect for the people they serve. And a day when a black man driving home in a nice car would be greeted with a nod of acknowledgement, not a demand to step out of his vehicle. The next morning, after a restless night, Jamal decided to take his proposal straight to the chief of police. As he drove to the station, he felt a curious mixture of hope and anxiety. He knew how these meetings usually went. Proposals like his were often met with polite nods and empty promises, then quietly shelved. But today he was determined to push harder. When he arrived, Chief Roger DeWitt was waiting. DeWitt was a stern, no-nonsense man known for strict adherence to procedure. He had a reputation for fairness, but Jamal knew the chief was also deeply protective of his officers. As Jamal stepped into the office, DeWitt stood extending a hand. Judge Hayes, DeWitt greeted with a nod. I heard about what happened last night. I want to personally apologize for the incident. Jamal shook his hand, his gaze steady. An apology is appreciated, Chief, but I'm not here for that. And I'm here to ensure it doesn't happen again to me or anyone else. DeWitt's brow furrowed, I understand. And I assure you, Officer Michael will face disciplinary action. That's not enough. Jamal interrupted firmly. This isn't just about one officer's conduct. So it's about the culture that enables these kinds of interactions. We need systemic change, Chief. So I have a proposal I want you to review. It's not about punishment. It's about building a bridge between law enforcement and the communities they serve. DeWitt's eyes narrowed slightly as Jamal handed over the document. He read in silence, his face a mask of concentration. As the minutes ticked by, Jamal watched him closely, searching for any sign that his words were sinking in. Finally, DeWitt looked up, his expression thoughtful. You're asking for a lot. He said slyly, mandatory training, community involvement, more direct accountability. This will require a significant shift in how we operate. Yes, Jamal agreed, because what we're doing now isn't working. You know that as well as I do. DeWitt leaned back in his chair, studying Jamal intently. Why not push for harsher penalties? Make an example out of Michaels. Jamal shook his head. If I push for her to be fired, it sends a message, sure, but that message is fear, not change. It makes other officers more careful about being caught, not about correcting the biases that leads us to these situations in the first place. The chief was silent for a long moment, then slowly nodded. All right, Judge Hayes, so let's try it your way. I'll bring this to the city council and see if we can get it implemented. The wave of relief washed over Jamal, but he tempered it with caution. It was all I asked, Chief, just a chance. As Jamal left the station, a sense of purpose filled him. This was just the beginning. He would follow up with the council, press the mayor's office, and if needed, rally public support. He knew there would be resistance. Change was always met with resistance, but he also knew that sometimes one person could spark a movement. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the seeds of Jamal's initiative began to take root. It started with small steps, meetings between officers and local leaders, workshops that forced participants to confront their own biases, and ride-alongs that paired young officers with community mentors. There were setbacks, of course. Some officers bristled at the new requirements, and a few outright refused to participate. But others, like Officer Michaels, began to show signs of transformation. So one evening, months later, Jamal received an unexpected call. It was Michaels. Judge Hayes, I wanted to thank you, she said hesitantly. I didn't understand at the time, but that night changed me. And I've been working with a local youth group, and I'm starting to see things differently. So I know I still have a lot to learn, but I'm trying. Jamal felt a swell of emotion, his grip tightening on the phone. That's all I ever wanted, Officer Michaels, for you to see, to understand. Keep at it. So as he hung up, he realized that the initiative wasn't just changing officers. It was changing him too. It had renewed his belief that even small steps could lead to real progress. Months turned into years, and the community began to feel the shift. Relationships formed between officers and residents. Trust, once shattered, was slowly rebuilt. The program gained recognition, serving as a model for other cities grappling with similar challenges. So one day, as Jamal walked through the very neighborhood where the confrontation had taken place, he saw something that made him pause. A young officer, familiar but bearing the same insignia as Michael, stood chatting amiably with a group of teenagers on the corner. There was no tension, no hostility, just laughter and conversation. Jamal smiled. It wasn't a perfect world, but it was a better one. And for that, he was grateful. So as in the end, true justice wasn't just about the absence of wrongdoing. It was about the presence of understanding, empathy, and the willingness to change. And that he thought was a victory worth fighting for.